The Zora in Echoes of Wisdom are the most intriguing and impactful they've ever been, with tantalizing lore implications for the entire franchise and a wonderful interspecies dynamic. But before we get into that, let's establish what sets this incarnation of the Zora apart. In a Zelda game, you can expect a familiar race to be associated with one of the dungeons. The most recurring are the Gorons, either the Deku or Kokiri, and the Zora. These are the core three, which can be joined by either the Gerudo or Rito, but the Zora have the most legacy behind them of any race, making their first appearance as enemies in the NES Zelda. These Zoras are nothing more than vicious monsters and are retrospectively tragic, as they clearly lost their sentience and became rabid beasts. Since then, the Zora have become an elegant race, who have a large focus on spirituality and wisdom, and in my opinion have the greatest glow-up in video game history. Their sleek and sharp Ocarina of Time designs make them into possibly my favourite elf variation ever. Yes, I know the Hylians are elves, but in the context of a fantasy realm, they're human-coded, while the Gorons are dwarves and the Zora are elves, since they're so refined. I mean, look at Zora's domain and tell me with a straight face that you don't see Rivendell. But while the Zora were the most frequently appearing race outside of the Hylians, they also had the most lore hidden behind them, especially with the Zora tablets and Breath of the Wild. Their culture clearly ran deeper than most other races. I never expected a Zelda game to put a spin on one of their races. Usually across the timelines, a race either exists exactly as they do in another timeline, evolve into a different one, or go extinct. The only exception to this is the Zora, who devolved in the Fallen Hero timeline and became the vicious freaks from the original game. But strangely, both the regal and feral variants of the Zora are present in Tears of the Kingdom, which ends up creating one of Zelda's best subplots. You may not believe me, but racism has had subtle undertones in Zelda many times, when one side is living more comfortable than another, and they ignore that class issue and prefer not to acknowledge them. This is the inciting incident for A Link Between Worlds, but there's far more examples across the series. Like in Majora's Mask, there's a shopkeeper who charges higher prices depending on your form, or Ganondorf feeding the Gorons rock roast that makes them angry as an allegory for the 80s crack epidemic. But the two involving the Zora are much more overt. Firstly, the doctor in Twilight Princess who refuses to treat a sick patient because they're a Zora, and Muzu in Breath of the Wild who blames all Hylians for the death of Mipha. I think it's interesting how the Zora are the subject of Zelda's more explicit examples of racism, and it shows how the complicated and alien design of the group stirs feelings of instinctual hatred in Hyrule's bigots. Echoes of Wisdom tackles this issue head-on, but within the Zora race itself, with the River and Sea Zora despising each other and always being on tumultuous and antagonistic footing, although it's curiously relegated to the leaders of the tribe, as the rank and file seem to think favourably of the other side. Their culture and way of life is shown through the music each tribe plays, and the different emotions and effects it has on the Zora, showing the respective leaders that the culture of the other side can achieve what theirs cannot. For example, the boisterous and energetic music of the River Zora is able to reignite the happiness of a scared child, whilst the Sea Zora are able to soothe the trauma of a River Zora who was exposed to the still world. It shows how a society is better as a multicultural one, where different beliefs and ways of life are the most effective because every culture brings something different to the table, but each still has its faults, and only by taking the best parts of each one can we make a harmonious society where all people can live together. But enough sentimentality, holy hell, what does this mean for the lore? How are two timelines crossed over like this? This isn't like the Zora and the Rito being in Breath of the Wild together. These two species shouldn't even be able to exist at the same time. The River Zora are the feral Zora that lost and then somehow regained their sentience after Ganon took over, and the Sea Zora are the spitting image of the Breath of the Wild Zora, not the Ocarina of Time ones. How can they possibly be together in the same world? With Null being the oldest being in the canon to date, Echoes of Wisdom opens up so much tantalizing lore to delve deep into. We know that Breath of the Wild is in its own timeline now, but surely Echoes of Wisdom has to be in one of the core three, right? There's just too many similarities to the Fallen Hero timeline for it to be anywhere else, and this is further emphasized by the presence of the River Zora. But how are the Breath of the Wild Zora here? Is something screwy happening with the timeline? Surely it can't just be evolution, can it? The Breath of the Wild Zora never lived in the sea, so the salt water can't have caused them to change that much. Is there something special about the timeline of the Wild where it might be seeping into the former timelines? Or has Nintendo realized that making a timeline was a massive mistake that just overcomplicated the franchise in a way they never intended, and just wish obsessed fans like me wouldn't freak out every time something slightly misaligned with canon? There's just so many possibilities! I'll be back in 2 days. In the meantime, here's a video about why the still world is my favorite alternate dimension in Zelda.